Thank you very much, Andrew. And yes, welcome to Beyond the Spin, presented by the ANU and 666 ABC Canberra. We're thrilled to be involved with this. I get very many calls and text messages from my listeners asking for detailed policy, and I know this event was booked out a week in advance, which shows that you are really interested in policy. And we've got a terrific panel of academics, including economists, a lawyer, scientists and a journalist, all of them highly regarded tonight. And the topic, of course, is climate change, climate policies and emissions trading. Now, I'm going to introduce our speakers just so you know the format, and we're going to have a panel discussion here, and I want it to be free-flowing so all the speakers can butt in with each other if they like, and then we'll put it out to questions to you. Please indicate if you want to ask a question. We'll get a microphone to you because the event's been recorded tonight. Penny will wave around microphones. And to each of our speakers, if you can direct, while you might like to talk to each other, but direct your answers and discussion to the audience, that would be great. So let me introduce the speakers. First of all, Professor Will Steffen is here. He is Executive Director of the ANU Climate Change Institute. Will Steffen has been an Executive Director of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program in Stockholm in Sweden, and his research interests span a broad range within the fields of climate change and the Earth system science. Also with us today is Warwick McKibbin, Professor Warwick McKibbin. He is Director of the ANU Research School of Economics. He's also a Professorial Fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy in Sydney and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, where he is Co-Director of the Climate and Energy E program. And Professor McKibbin is internationally renowned for his contributions to global economic modelling. And next to me is Dr. Frank Jotzo, who's an economist at the ANU Crawford School and the Deputy Director of the ANU Climate Change Institute. He's worked on climate policy for the past 12 years, including being an advisor to the Garnaut Review and also Indonesia's Minister of Ministry of Finance and various other roles. Bernard Keane, here at the end, is a Canberra correspondent for Crikey and writes on politics, economics and climate change issues. Before joining Crikey in 2008, he was a blogger, a bureaucrat and speechwriter. Andrew Macintosh, at the end here, is an environmental law and policy expert and is Associate Director of the ANU Centre for Climate Law and Policy. He's worked as a solicitor in the big city law firms, tutored in law at Cambridge University, worked as an environmental advisor to the Australian Democrats, and he's currently co-writing a history of the environment and heritage portfolio under the Howard government. And next to me, Dr. Liz Hanna is a fellow at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health here at the ANU, researching the impacts of climate change on population health and building public health preparedness. Dr. Hanna is a member of the e-Health Committee and consults for state and federal departments of health and the Department of Climate Change to conduct human health vulnerability assessments to the impacts of climate change. So thanks to all our panel for taking part this evening. And we start at the point of accepting the science that climate change is happening and that human activity is a major contributor. And if I can begin with one of our scientists tonight, and that's Professor Will Steffen. Will Steffen, you want to underline the importance of climate science. You say if the science is forgotten, that policy can easily drift towards nonsense. Explain what you mean.
Right. I think what you need to do is look at a very simple equation. First of all, what is the cost of inaction? By inaction, I mean inaction that would take us beyond 2 degrees Celsius and all the associated changes. That is the missing part of the equation. The costs of that are very large and they're escalating. And I mean not just economic costs, but social costs and environmental costs. So how do we meet that 2-degree guardrail? And this is the thing that the policy needs to keep coming back to. How do we meet the 2-degree guardrail? Well, to do that, developed countries like ourselves have to cut emissions. If we could top out next year, we have to cut them by 3% a year till about 2050. That's a really big ask. But we can't top them out next year. There's too much momentum in the economic and energy systems. Let me just tell you what a few years of delay means. From 2011 to 2015, 4 years. 4 years delay means we go from 3% to 5.5% per year emission cuts. Huge. If we delay to 2020, only 9 years down the track, that goes to an almost impossible 9.5%. 9.5%. So the science is clear. Every year's delay from this point is crucial. And there's a compelling case that if we slide and slip, there is no way any economy can meet the emission cuts that are required. So that's the challenge we face.
I suppose the question, and I've posed this to you on air before, why have climate scientists not been able to get the message through clearly?
Well, I think a lot of my colleagues are used to speaking to their peers, fellow scientists. There we tend to emphasize the questions, the burning questions, the things that we want to research in the future. We talk much less about what we really know. When you enter the public debate, I think it's important for science to state quite clearly what we know with a high degree of certainty, which is what most of us are not used to talking about. And that's part of the big problem.
Liz Hanna, if I can come to you, and we talk about rises in temperature, and I know it's a question you field a lot. People live in hot places. Why is this a problem?
It's, even though people do live in hot places, as in people live in deserts, their lifestyle is very different to ours. And the key problem basically lies in the fact that we need to maintain our core temperature around about 37 degrees. When we exercise, 80% of that, over 80% of the energy that we produce is actually heat, and we have to dissipate that into the environment. So when it gets over 37, it's actually very hard to keep physically working. And even just going out to the car, doing the shopping, not to mention physical work. And so we need to actually drink an enormous amount of fluid. So once the temperature, for example, when Melbourne recently hit very close to 50 degrees, this is way outside our physical capacity to keep functioning. And we can't do this certainly in the city environment.
Is that something, and can you hear Liz Hanna? I think there might be a microphone malfunction. If we can just, is Jack about? I'm not sure if your microphone's working. Is that working? We'll just, just to go to Liz's point when she talked about Melbourne, which was and of course the horrific bushfires in Victoria. Liz, do we need to remember? We'll just, if you can bear with us. Thanks for your patience. Okay, I'll just go to Liz again. I suppose you referred to the temperatures in Melbourne where we saw rail lines start to buckle. But before that, in Adelaide, of course, we heard about the makeshift morgues that were being brought in. Is that the kind of thing that you're dealing with and talking about and warning of for Australians when it comes to climate change?
Yes, because again, what we're noticing is it's not just the first hot day that people keel over. It's once we've had a succession of hot days. And part of that, of course, will be a function of the fact that the housing stock warms up. And so if people don't cool down at night, particularly when we had in Melbourne recently a night that was, the minimum was about 33 degrees.
I think it's not working.
Not working at all. Okay.
There we are.
Have temperatures where the minimum is so hot that people don't actually get to cool down, the house doesn't cool down, there's no respite. And we actually find mortality rates actually increasing quite quickly after a few successive days. So Adelaide had that, their heat wave was 15 days, where the previous record was only about 7. So this is another thing. The records are being broken by large margins, which is very much out of the ordinary.
Which brings us to our economists and modellers. Dr. Frank Jotzo, why do we need carbon pricing?
Okay, so what we want to do is we want to take the carbon out of the economy. Okay, carbon is everywhere in the economy. Whatever you do, whatever you buy, whatever service you provide, there's some amount of incorporated carbon emissions in that. We want to reduce that. Now, this is not a task for some sort of central planner or bureaucracy to decide we're going to do X here and Y there and Z over there. It is something that's best done by the market, right? You put a price signal in there, and every individual, every business will tend to do what is profitable for them once they're faced with that extra cost on carbon. So it's really the efficient way of going about it. It's doing the cheapest things first and leaving the more expensive ones for later on. It's the way that you get the most bang for every buck that you may want to spend on emission reductions. And when we're thinking about putting a price on it, we may be thinking about a great new tax. And when we're thinking that, we also really need to keep in mind that whenever you raise a tax, you actually got a lot of revenue, which you can use to do things, which you can give back to people, which you can use to lower other taxes. So this is the other part of the equation.
Such as the pink VAT scheme.
Such as whatever you may want to care to pay less income tax, perhaps, right? Or extra funding for the ABC may be an option. So possibilities are endless, really.
I'll come to Warwick McKibbin in a moment. How would the interim carbon price proposal by the Greens work immediately? And then look at that longer term, just briefly.
Yeah, it's the kind of proposal that tries to maximise the use of that extensive architecture that's already there, that's been designed and redesigned and negotiated and renegotiated over the last 5 years or so. And using that architecture without necessarily putting a target in place, but to just get a carbon price in the economy and to provide that shorter term investment certainty that business is crying out for. So technically speaking, it would work by the government requiring a permit to be acquitted for every tonne of CO2 that comes in under the scheme. All of that is already there. The legislation for the measurement and reporting of emissions is already in place. You need to hand in a permit at the end of the year, and you can buy that permit from the government at a fixed pre-announced price.
Warwick McKibbin, why do both major parties shy away from carbon pricing?
Well, I think they're worried about the short-term economic costs, and you've got to get the perspective horizon correct. There are different carbon prices we care about. The short-term carbon price is a pure cost to society. You pay more. The long-term carbon price is the benefit the society can reap by actually undertaking changes to their behaviour and therefore making a profit out of those long-term investments in technologies. So the big issue here is to get the long-term carbon price right in the economy. Any of the approaches which only focus on the short-term carbon price will end up with both parties saying we can't afford the costs because there are very few benefits from a short-term carbon price. The Greens' proposal of having a short-term carbon price and hoping that something comes together, I think is just inadequate. You could have a $10 a tonne carbon price today, knowing with certainty that the carbon price will be $100 in 20 years. You'll get far more action out of that at low short-term costs than a $100 carbon price today that you can guarantee will be destroyed by the next change of government. No one will respond to a $100 incentive except very short-term reaction. It's the long-term price that matters. And so I think the politicians are responding to people's hip pocket desire, and that's why focusing on the short-term carbon price is actually a very counterproductive policy.
But the word's a great big new tax. A tax compared to a market solution?
Well, it is a great big new tax if nothing's going to happen and if you think the carbon price will be gone in 3 years' time. And that's the trouble with having these taxes which are just short-term fixes. You need a long-term carbon pricing system so that if you're investing in a 30 or 40-year technology whose payoff won't come for 30 or 40 years, you need to be able to have some way of estimating what the carbon price might be. And a market is the best way of doing that. That's what long-term bond markets do. They give us long-term interest rates which drive our investments in all sorts of human capital and physical capital. And that's what we need, the analogy in the carbon market, and we're just not getting it from any of the political parties.
In the latest model you've proposed, if I understand it correctly, in a nutshell, you say we should divvy up the atmosphere and allocate shares in advance over the next 100 years. And all of us then have a long-term stake in the atmosphere.
Correct.
Is that correct? In reality, will everyone promise to do that? And I say, look, we'll just put it off, we'll pay it in 20 years. And then you get to 20 years and they'll go, actually, other things are happening now. So you can't turn around and be a debt collector in 20 years' time.
No, let's be very clear. My latest proposal, which is now 16 years old, but people haven't, people haven't been listening because there was this artificial deceit that Kyoto was the only way of dealing with climate policy. So if you didn't agree with Kyoto, you didn't agree with taking action on climate. Fortunately, luckily for the planet, Copenhagen has put paid to that particular belief. So we now have an open debate on where do we actually need to go with policy. So that's critical. My view is that if you have a commitment, if a government commits to an emissions target, you can create property rights over that target, just like we create property rights over real estate. Once people own things which are scarce, they're willing to trade them and preserve them in a marketplace. And if it's a credible pre-commitment to reduce emissions, those that have those property rights have the potential for very large profits in the future. Now, they should be in the hands of the people, not in the hands of Treasury, not in the hands of politicians who can divvy them out to the ABC or whoever gets in the door next. The lobbyists love this short-sightedness of the carbon debate that we're currently having because they make a lot of money out of it with very little carbon reduction in reality.
And I'm going to talk about carbon accounting very soon, but I suppose one of the biggest problems with the emissions trading scheme, no one understood it.
Well, that's not really a very good criticism because no one understands monetary policy. Yet we have in this country, no, this is real. This is a real issue. I should mention I'm on the board of the Reserve Bank, so I'm speaking as a private citizen here. No one understands monetary policy. If you asked 150 people to design a monetary system that would do what we've done in this country, you would have zero interest rates and runaway inflation. So the people don't have to understand the mechanism, but they have to be confident that it's been through a process where the experts have agreed that this is the way forward.
Well, to the lawyer on our panel, Andrew Macintosh, when it comes to carbon accounting, it's been put to me that it's easy for a lot of jiggery-pokery. What are your thoughts about that? Discuss.
Yeah, great understatement of the year. I'll give you one example. Everybody knows that Australia's target's 5 to 25, right? That's what our target is. Can someone give me a number? What that actually converts into a number. Now, people who read the numbers, I'll tell you, well, our 5% target translates into 525 megatons of CO2e by 2020. It'd surprise you if I told you, well, hold on a minute, that target is actually invalid. Under the current laws, under UNFCCC and Kyoto accounting laws, that target actually doesn't exist. It's a non-target. So in fact, we're going to this election with no target range. In fact, we just have basically pretend numbers until such time as the accounting rules concerning what they call LULUCF, land use change and forestry, are set. And the real X factor for Australia is deforestation emissions. In 1990, our deforestation emissions were about 120 million tonnes, and then they fell. They didn't fall because of public policy, primarily. They fell because of economic factors and climate factors. Now, what we did in the Kyoto first period is we said, hold on, if we include 120 million tonnes in our base year number, what does that do? It raises the base year, and as a result of our emissions already falling, we can claim about 70 million tonnes of stuff that we did, policy-wise, we did. And we claim that against our target. And as a result, we're going to meet our Kyoto target. But in fact, we've done very little to achieve it. It's actually just a non-policy induced reduction in deforestation. That's just one example of the many things that can occur with the accounting rules, in particular the land use change and forestry rules, because they're very, very complex. And basically no one, very few people look at them in detail, even during the negotiating period, where people are not following what's going on in the LULUCF negotiations, notwithstanding that they're now basically one of the core elements of the negotiation.
Bernard Keane, the other journalist. Prime Minister Julia Gillard says if she wins, she'll hold a People's Convention of 150 ordinary Australians to come up with a consensus on climate action. A clunker or a good move?
Well, definitely the former. There's any number of issues bound up in that. One of those is, I think, a kind of bastardised version of the problem that Warwick alluded to, which is how do you actually build in a long-term system that's going to survive the thrills and spills of politics? Because a system that could be put in place next year could be altered quite significantly 3 years later, with enormous implications for business certainty and levels of investment. So I think one of the issues that Warwick's raised is how do you actually lock in a system that's actually going to survive not just years but generations of politics. Now, I don't think Julia Gillard's about that. I think what she's about is actually trying to shift the role of providing leadership from the politicians, particularly the Labor politicians who've been subject to a terrible and very, very effective attack by rent seekers over the CPRS and, for that matter, other issues as well. But shifting the responsibility for that leadership onto a sort of motherhood-like group of unimpeachable, ordinary Australians whose views, once we establish what they are, therefore attain the status of motherhood. I mean, no one could argue with the views of ordinary Australians. So that's, in effect, that provides political cover, and I think I think that the problem that the whole 150 the Citizens' Assembly issue created for the government was people saw through that very, very quickly. They saw through it and saw that this was a government actually looking to defer the leadership that people had expected of them 3 years ago onto ordinary people. I mean, let's not forget, 3 years ago we had John Howard and Kevin Rudd both promising to introduce an emissions trading scheme. And in fact, John Howard boasted it would be the world's most comprehensive emissions trading scheme. 3 years later, we've got to the stage where bizarrely we've run away from that policy on both sides in favour of not just confections like the Citizens' Assembly, but the idea of actually shifting the cost of action in the direction that politicians always like to move it, to taxpayers, because that's actually much more easily hidden from the public than either a tax-based system or a price, or a system that embeds a price into ordinary everyday goods.
What's the, and I'll throw it open to everyone here. I mean, where do you think we're at now? We've got Julie Gillard's People's Convention for a Climate Consensus, Tony Abbott's talking direct action. We've got predictions that we'll have 9 Green senators. Where do you think politics is headed on this? Warwick McKibbin?
Well, if you look at the whole domain of the views on climate change, you've got in the centre a majority of Australians. They want to take action, they're willing to pay a price, but they just want a system that's going to work. You've got the green environmentalists on the left and you've got industry groups on the right. The answer is to get the right and the left to come towards the centre and to have a policy framework that everybody can live with. Now, we can do that under the current CPRS. If you take the carbon pollution reduction scheme and you look at where its flaws, the flaw from the environmental movement's point of view is it is basically a cap and trade system and it doesn't have deep cuts. Now, you can have deep cuts and you can also get rid of cap and trade. The trouble with cap and trade is if you decide as an individual to cut your emissions today, it does nothing to emissions today, it just lowers the price. And that's a common feature of cap and trade because the target is the target.
But where has it actually worked?
No, but what you can do though...
Where has a cap and trade system?
Well, you could argue that the cap and trade worked very well for sulphur dioxide trading in the US.
That's the only example that's...
Well, you could argue that the ETS in Europe, although as flawed and as debased as it was, did actually change the price of carbon in a way that caused some behavioural response. But you really want to have a comprehensive price. Now, let's think, just if I can continue my argument. So we can do the deep cuts, but what's industry's worry? Well, the industry's worry is if you go deep cuts and it's hard to do it, it could be very expensive. So if you have a safety valve on the price in the short term, so you can say, look, we'll go deeply, but if it's too expensive this year, there's a mechanism for smoothing it out over time. So by bringing in a safety valve price, or what I call the hybrid idea of a tax in the short term, with a deep cuts proposal where if it's achievable, you go for it, you can bring in the left and the right, you've got a system that can sustain itself, because the other factor here that we have to realise is, yes, short-term carbon prices are an input cost, but reducing uncertainty and reducing risk is an increase in the returns to capital, a reduction in the cost of capital. So industry are actually quite happy with a low carbon price, with a market that lets them hedge risk. That's a net benefit. So you bring them into the tent and you have a system that can move forward.
Let me go to Frank and Andrew.
Alex, you're asking where we're at with regard to carbon pricing in a political sense. And I have a sense we are somewhere in that space where we used to be with the GST at some point. It has proven lethal to a number of politicians, somewhere along the lines. And what is needed is to actually take the plunge and do it. And then it'll become somewhat of a non-issue because people...
Well, some people would put it down to 2 prime ministers and 2 opposition leaders. It's done in...
There's a great piece of graffiti, if anyone knows, the O'Connor Dam. If you look in the O'Connor Dam at the moment, there's the big list of the leaders that have fallen by the wayside as a result of carbon pricing. I want to get a photo before someone bites it off.
Except they haven't fallen by the wayside because of carbon pricing, but because of the demonisation of it. If there was carbon pricing, then, I mean, my confident prediction would be that it would not rock the boat in any kind of meaningful way. We're talking about a marginal change in terms of what will be paying more, but mostly offset through price reductions in other areas and through fiscal changes.
Your GST is the perfect example. I mean, you remember the beat-up and everybody was carrying on about the GST. They introduced it and it disappeared within 12 months. It became a complete non-issue. And there was Kim Beazley still arguing the case. In the GST, it's killing us. Everyone's like, I don't know what he's talking about.
The key difference there is that with the GST, we had two politicians, and in particular Peter Costello, but John Howard as well, who understood the danger of actually giving in to either rent seekers or, well, rent seekers in general, and actually held the line up until virtually the end. I mean, they had to cave in to Meg Lees at the end. But they were one of the, and I was working the bureaucracy at this point, there was a very clear message that there was to be no caving in whatsoever. And that was actually, and that was a great policy achievement in terms of sending a signal to industry, to community groups, to NGOs that there wouldn't be compromise on the basic issues around the GST. Certainly what Labor has now created for itself is an enormous rod for its own back, because industry knows that it is very susceptible to even a half decent lobbying campaign, let alone the very well resourced
We got the
sort of
Greenhouse
campaign that we
Office
saw
because of
from-
a deal about the GST with Meg Lees.
Let's be clear what the GST is about. It wasn't to set a target for something, it was to set a price. People knew, once you knew the price of the GST, approximately what it would do to costs in the economy. If you just pick an arbitrary target, let's say 50% reduction by 2050, you don't know what the price of that will be. If you were China and you'd taken on the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, you would be more than double above your promised emissions, and you'd be walking away from that agreement tomorrow, today or yesterday, because the cost was too high. So it's critical that we focus the emission reduction debate around how much are we willing to pay, so we can get policies on the table where we're paying something rather than nothing, and being fixated with targets which will never be achieved if we don't do anything.
I'll just come back to our scientists, and then I certainly want to bring you into the discussion as well. So if you want to indicate if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll get a microphone to you. But Liz, do you argue that human survival is at stake?
Oh, absolutely. And the question I was sort of just jibbing up and down wanting to ask is, which of these are actually going to start bringing down or reducing carbon emissions fast enough? Because as Will says, we simply do not have the time. I mean, even though we know jolly well that we can't attribute any particular climate event to climate change, but the trend is really significant here. And so we've got people dying. There's certainly the increase in heat waves that we've been having. The drought in the Murray-Darling Basin, and the fact that that's completely stuffed is really quite serious. And of course, that not only does it impact on the rural communities, but all the people that are actually living in those communities as they're quietly going broke and moving out. So the community well-being is just collapsing in many of those areas. Not to mention all those other things that are happening with Russia and Pakistan hitting 53.5 and the floods everywhere. And so, I mean, it's the rate of change.
So you're frustrated as a scientist listening to these economic...
Yes. Whichever mechanism. I mean, obviously, last thing I'd do is comment on which economic system would be the best to actually bring it apart. But I'm certainly pushing the fact that whatever method is chosen, that it's something that can actually make a big, real difference very, very soon.
Well, Steffen?
Yeah, I think Warwick's made a couple of good points that are in concert with the science. One is we've got to get started and get started soon. So I think we'd all be willing to agree that getting started on an imperfect scheme now is probably better than waiting and trying to design the perfect scheme 15 years down the track. Also, I think psychologically, getting over that first hump, people may realize it's not going to kill economies, it's not going to kill lifestyles, it may actually improve lifestyles. Then things may go faster. The second important thing that Warwick said is we have to take a long-term perspective, both in the science and in the economics. That's true, and that comes together. But the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about is what's the cost of not getting on top of this? That never comes up. The cost is astronomical. In the worst case scenario, I think modern civilization will collapse, like many other civilizations have. What's the cost of that? What's the cost of massive loss of life? What's the cost of having no viable economy? If you're looking at the top-end scenarios, that's what you're looking at. If you're looking at the mid-range scenarios, I think you're looking at something that very few of us will really be able to cope with. We might muddle through in some areas in the far north. Perhaps some of the Scandinavian countries may do okay, but we won't. So the cost of not getting on top of it is much greater than the cost of even putting in a very ambitious scheme now. But that psychological debate has yet to be had, and it's very important that we get on top of it.
Well, Andrew, yes,
Well, if I
Warwick.
just come back, Will, to the point, though, that an imperfect scheme is better than nothing. The Kyoto Protocol, according to all the advocates, was a pretty good scheme that was going to save the planet. And from my point of view, it was a disaster because it let people believe that action was underway when it actually wasn't. These were just promises, empty promises by governments who could promise 20 years or 30 years from now that reductions would occur. And when the rubber hit the road, not a single country took action of any meaningful magnitude.
But let me say, I was not referring to the Kyoto Protocol. I was referring to meaningful action that starts the curve down.
Really?
That's what I'm talking about.
That's how the Kyoto Protocol was described. I was debating a number of people since 1992 on this topic, and they're saying it's going to work.
But not in the scientific community. What I'm saying is something needs to be credible to those of us who look at the atmosphere, not look at economies and politics.
And just to bring
needs to start coming down.
Andrew and Bernard in. Andrew, you've worked close to politics. How do you do it? Politically, how do you sell this?
Well, I just wanted to say, I agree that we have to get a carbon price in place, and I agree, I have great sympathies with what Warwick's talking about in terms of getting the right system in place. But before we get there, I think there's a lot of things we could do. At the moment, unfortunately, we have a collection of policies that are more decorative policies than anything. Frank gave a great talk at our conference today, about and he mentioned the cash for clunkers in terms of great dud policies. But it's not the only one. You know, there's many other dud policies out there at the moment, and the real intent is not to cut emissions, and it's certainly not to do it in the least cost way. It's to give the impression to us, all of us, that the government's actually doing something. And rather than wasting money on those ideas and that basically wasting our time, we can invest that money in areas where we could actually get real emission abatement. And the land sector, again, is an area where we could actually employ $100 million would get you a lot in the land sector in terms of cuts before we get to the point where we're introducing an emissions trading scheme or a carbon price, which is exactly where I think we should be headed.
The issue of, do you go for an imperfect scheme now or do you wait to design the perfect? I mean, that's a very difficult issue that a lot of us have been grappling with. And for the Greens, for example, rejected the CPRS because they just thought it was too imperfect. I spent a lot of time trying to work out whether the CPRS was worth it just to get something in place. And eventually my conclusion was, it just on balance, it just locked in too much. Or it just locked away too little of a price signal until the mid-2020. So I didn't think it really, I thought it's so bad that maybe it does not fit that criterion. But at some point there is the time issue does start to press in on you because if we're talking about 2020 targets, well, all of a sudden it's 2010 or it's nearly 2011. Okay. Where are we going to go? So that issue of, do we need to construct a perfect scheme? But we are, at the moment, we're torn between, do we have a perfect scheme, or what is the perfect scheme, and these extraordinarily expensive direct action policies which don't do anything, or if they do something, it's $350, $400 a tonne of emissions.
I've just done the numbers on the Solar Homes and Communities Plan, broken down by jurisdiction. The abatement cost in Tasmania this is the PV program, the solar photovoltaic program. The abatement cost in Tasmania on average was $2,200. A winner. And at the beginning it was over $4,000 a tonne.
That's our taxpayer dollars at work.
Okay. Now I think I can see hands going up, and I think the time has come to ask, and probably not so much statements, but questions would be great. I can do the Tony Jones. I'll take that as comment, but perhaps so from here in the green vest.
Bernard, you talked about you made a judgment the CPRS wasn't perhaps the right thing, but the fact is, because of it fell over, we've really probably lost 4 years, and in terms of what Will said, that's a hell of a lot of time. I think we need a price signal, and we need to have an international thing. We must not forget we can't do it on our own. We've got to work something globally. So it almost seems to me it was a real tragedy that we lost the CPRS. We could have had, even though it was fairly imperfect, had a leadership role because we'd done something. As a middle power, we could have been out there. Now we don't have that, and we're probably looking at 4 or 5 years before we get some sort of comprehensive scheme in place.
And the question that I would get daily on air is, and John Howard used to say it all the time, why would we sign up to something when China and America and India haven't?
But again, it depends what you're signing up to. At the moment, Australia is facing real economic costs because people aren't investing either in conventional energy systems or alternative energy systems. This will lead to an increase in the cost of capital, increase in energy prices. There's a real opportunity cost. And we know that it's valuable to industries because they're paying lobbyists a fortune to intervene in the policy process. So Yeah, there are real gains from reducing the uncertainty, not eliminating uncertainty. There's no such thing as giving industry certainty. You want to give them the capacity to manage their own risks, both renewable energy investment risks and conventional energy investment risks. That's the critical point here.
And Frank?
I'd just like to take up two things from your question. One is pragmatism, one is the international scene. The EU experience with emissions trading is actually very instructive. They started in phase 1, back 6-7 years now, with a really messy system, right? I mean, everyone agrees it was bad, right? But it was a start. They improved it in phase 2 and phase 3. The way it's shaping up is really pretty good under the constraints that they have, recession going on, lobbying pressure, 27 different national governments and all the rest of it. That's really not looking too bad. And I think we need to basically not let the best be the enemy of the good here and just make a start. And that really comes back to cash for clunkers. As long as we don't have a comprehensive policy in place, like carbon pricing of any sort, really, we're going to get more of these policies, and you're going to pay $20, and you and everyone else are going to take that money and give it to someone who's quick off the mark and buy a new car, right? And not a clean new car, no, any car that's a little bit more efficient than the average that's on the road already, right? And we're going to use all that money that we've taken from you and not use it to support R&D into solar energy, into solar concentrated power, right? So if that sounds a good policy to you, go for it, And the fiscal cost of this will be $400 a tonne, when for $20 a tonne, you can actually begin transformational change throughout the economy. On international, we will never be leading, right? Countries leading at the moment include China, okay? So it's very likely that China in the next few years will be implementing emissions trading, at least on a trial basis. It's very likely that China will be having province-level emissions targets for 2015. So all manner of policies already in place to support renewable energy, to dampen energy demand in China, then we'll get to in a fair while in Australia.
I think there's a question down at the front.
Hi there. I'd like to ask about climate change, refugees, migrants, displaced persons, whatever you'd like to call them. How do you think this issue should be dealt with? Do you think that the countries that are the biggest polluters should be the ones that help pay for their resettlement?
Liz, is that you?
Yeah. This is working now?
I think if you hold it up, I think it is.
Okay. But it's a great question. Thank you for that. It's there is no doubt that there will be large numbers of people moving and being forced to move because they're no longer be able to feed themselves and with water. Issues that will follow from that, of course, will be they'll want to move into areas where there's already problems. And so people are already feeling threatened that their quality of life is diminishing because of their own shortages. And of course, historically speaking, if you have a look at any time throughout history, when resources become scarce, the really charming features of the human spirit come out, and we really go in hell for leather, and there will be conflict, and so it'd be very difficult to actually maintain civil society in those terms. Can we actually ignore and refuse that? I don't think anyone can. And so the moral question of do the polluters have a greater moral responsibility to take them? Without doubt, will that happen is a very, very different question.
The reality at the moment is that Australia's policy is to just wish it wouldn't happen and hope that it all goes away. The geopolitical reality, though, is that a lot of this is going to happen in our own region, in the Pacific, which is where we have a traditional responsibility, and at some point we're going to have to deal with that. But if we're talking about things like refugees, I mean, most of the refugees will be internal. They won't be coming to Australia or New Zealand, but they'll be moving internally within their own country. That's what you tend to get with refugees. They tend to move internally rather than across borders. So the stability issues that raises, even if you're not talking directly about moving large numbers of people, are going to be significant. And this traditional perception of the Pacific and the areas around north as the arc of instability, I think, which is a sort of foreign affairs term that has a lot of fans, is only going to be exacerbated by climate issues, which are already having an effect on salination of water sources in low-lying island communities, for example. I mean, these are real issues right now for people in the Pacific. And we're offering money, but I think in the hope that if we throw enough money at it, we won't actually have to deal with the long-term problems that you get with, you know, the long-term viability of some of these smaller, low-lying states.
Yes, please.
And we need to bear in mind, we're not talking about the distant future here. There's currently 1.2 billion people in the world who are currently undernourished. And we could well argue that we're doing very, very little to support those people currently. So it's this is clearly going to exacerbate.
I think we've got a question over here in the red jumper.
Yep. Somebody brought up China and India, and the cost of climate change to Australia will depend very much on what the people of China and India do. At the moment, they're emitting an average of 2 tonnes per year per person, which coincidentally is what the science tells us is the sustainable level to keep the climate stable. Now, in Canberra, we are currently debating whether to have the most ambitious carbon target in Australia at about a minimum of, between about 12 and 16 tonnes per person per annum by 2020. What sort of carbon target should we be thinking of setting in order to convince the Chinese and the Indians that we're serious about climate change?
No.
Well, the Chinese and the Indians, other members of the basic group, were saying prior to Copenhagen that they expected developed countries to sign up to an aggregate target of 40%. And that's what they were saying. I doubt whether they thought that the developed countries were going to go that far, but I would be very surprised if those major developing countries would sign up to anything substantial and come good on it unless we adopted targets of about 30% as an aggregate. At the moment, we're somewhere between 10 and 14%, depending on how you move those rules I was talking about previously.
That's by 2020.
That's by 2020, yes. And really, it's the number that counts. I mean, you can talk about long-term targets till the cows come home, but everybody knows that it's the 2020, it's the near-term targets that really matter because they're the ones that demonstrate a willingness to actually do something.
Frank Jotzo and then Warwick McKibbin.
Yeah, look, there's a really, really deep inequity in the whole problem. It's, first of all, it'll be mostly developing countries that suffer from impacts from climate change. And secondly, in the remaining carbon budget that we have, and we had an excellent presentation again at that conference at the ANU Climate Change Law Centre today by Mike Rohrback, talking about how much space is there actually left to emit carbon in the atmosphere. And the developing countries today will not be able to follow the same development path as we have if we want to comply with any kind of reasonable mitigation target for the world as a whole. Okay, so there's a basic inequity. And now we've got to come to grips with that. And that will require for the rich world to do ambitious things and things that are regarded as ambitious by the poorer regions of the world, and it will require resource transfer from the rich world to the developing countries because capital is a lot scarcer there, and in particular public funding is a lot scarcer there, and will need to pay for some of the action. In India, China is a bit of a special situation, given its new status as a global power, but most of the developing world will need financing from developed countries, and that's still something where we have the beginnings of something meaningful under the Copenhagen Accord, but countries need to follow through with that now.
Warwick McKibbin.
So if I could alienate at least 50% of the audience, let me just make the following point. There's a big difference between who should be cutting and who should be paying for the cuts. The idea that countries should all cut by the same amount and that's regarded as equivalent action is completely false. And this is where the negotiations break down. This is where the whole system has come to a grinding halt. You should be cutting where it's cheapest on the planet to cut first. And it may well be that it all occurs in a developing country. It may well be for Australia, take Australia for example, when you model a country like Australia, which has an enormous endowment of fossil fuels, and you set a common global price, those countries that get very little output per unit of energy per unit of carbon are the ones that disappear first as emitters. And it's the Australians, unfortunately, are the ones that are left producing carbon because we are the most expensive, most efficient carbon polluters. Now, if you take that as the economic outcome of any of these systems, the critical question is, how do you transfer the resources to the low-cost actions? Why would we cut in the ACT if it turns out this is the best place on the planet to be emitting carbon. It is against the nature and laws of fundamental economics. And the system will collapse eventually if you go too much against basic economic reality. And you can laugh, but that's why we are today where we are when the Kyoto promises that were made in 1997 were made. Yes, we can do this, we just violate the laws of economics. No, you can't. The bottom line will eventually dominate the policy, and you have to put that up front in the design of the global system, or you won't get anywhere no matter how well-meaning you are. And that's how we got into the problem we got today. That's the reality.
I think there's another question over this. Oh, here in the red vest.
Andrew, you suggested, if I heard right, that we could invest $100 million and buy abatement from the land sector. I'm wondering 2 questions on that. Who's liable if that soil carbon or carbon stored in trees is lost in a drought or bushfire? And the second question is, putting all our money into those sort of abatement options, does that not just distract us from the task of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels?
Firstly, I wasn't saying pour all your money into it. I'm saying in the interim, if we're going to spend money on interim programs, let's spend it on somewhere we can actually get some long-term and decent-sized abatement out of it. And secondly, in terms of who's liable if it turns out that, say, we plant trees or we get regrowth in an area and then they burn, and who's liable for that? Well, it depends on what scheme you're talking about, but let's just say that you converted a deforested land unit and you allowed the forest to regrow, and under Kyoto rules that'd count, and then that burnt down. Well, if provided it regrows, over the long term you're going to get more carbon on that land unit than you otherwise would. Now, while you might have an interim loss in terms of a particular counting year, over the long term it'll be a greater source, a greater sink than it otherwise would have been. And I think that's a good thing, even though you might have, particular years where it's less than it might have been.
I'll make a comment on
Sure,
that.
well,
Scientifically, there's actually a difference between the two, fossil fuel, carbon, and carbon and landscape. Carbon and landscape is part of the active biological cycle, which goes between atmosphere, land, and sea all the time. Fossil carbon is quite different scientifically. It's locked away from that cycle, and by accessing it and burning it, we're throwing it into that cycle. You can never offset fossil carbon long-term by trying to put it in the land. The only thing you can do is replace the legacy carbon that's come from past deforestation. And as you pointed out, there's some real vulnerabilities with that carbon. Let me play the scenario out, which may very well happen, is countries decide they're going to try to offset for the next decade or two by shoving carbon into the landscape. 2 huge problems with that. One is they would be tempted to delay action to transform their energy systems, locking in more fossil fuel intensive carbon emitting systems. Second of all, though, temperature will rise and continue to rise because the big ticket item isn't the emissions from deforestation. That's only 15% now, 85% is fossil fuel. Temperature will continue to rise and it will lead to vulnerability of that carbon you've just stored, vulnerability of more carbon you've just shoved into the landscape, which will then reappear in the atmosphere and accelerate the warming. There's a real trap with offsetting in landscapes. I'm not saying you shouldn't put carbon in landscapes. There's a lot of good reasons for doing it, but don't do it as an offset for reducing fossil fuel emissions. The science is absolutely clear on that point.
Now, I think we've got a question up here.
This is probably addressed to the economist and the lawyer, Andrew, Frank and Warwick. If you believe apparently well-informed political commentators like Lenore Taylor from the Sydney Morning Herald, a key part of the then kitchen cabinet made up of Tanaswad, Gillard and Rubbs to sit and to defer the ETS was a fear that in people's minds the current steeply increasing electricity prices right around Australia would be confused with the emissions price. And if that's true, it probably means that it would be a bit like trying to bring in the GST when the second oil price shock was happening. In as much as those price increases are largely due to a backlog of distribution and transmission investment. They're not due at all, as we all know, to emissions trading, which hasn't started. So if all that is true, what do you think of an idea of requiring electricity retailers to separately list on their electricity bill the real cost of carbon to consumers, rather than allowing them to think that the whole increase is just because of carbon trading? Because I fear that a lot of people think they're already paying for carbon trading.
If I could.
Sure.
Yeah,
Warwick,
so what I would, first best here is to actually make it so that the rights to emit are held by the consumers themselves, and they sell those rights to industry that needs to abate, and there you get a revenue transfer which is far larger than the increase in the cost of your electricity. So you as a consumer, by knowing how the system works, you're better off financially. How can that be? In my system, I want to take the next 100 years' worth of rights and give them to the current generation, let them sell these rights in a market and get lots of compensation for the increases in prices which are inevitable. I think it's a furphy to try and explain to people that a great big tax is a bad thing. It's only a bad thing because the revenue is disappearing somewhere down a black hole. It's a really good thing if the revenue goes into your bank account and you're getting more from the revenue than you're paying in higher prices. To me, making that direct link is a key part of the politics of this. And this comes back to the question from the gentleman in the green sweater. If the government had given the property rights to carbon to 50% of the 50% of the rights to all of the population, how could you not win an election by giving that enormous compensation bundle to voters as compensation for future energy prices over the next 100 years of their life?
Who gets what rights?
It's quite easy. Every person who's alive gets a fixed share of the rights. You're not doing income redistribution in my policy. You're just compensating uniformly. You can have other policies that redistribute income. Do them through the...
A farmer gets the same amount as someone living in a city, is that right?
Well, you could divide it up into different... If a farmer is a producer as well as a consumer, then you'd make a different allocation. But generally, the issue here is you've got far more to redistribute if you make these very long-term rights than if you just make them a one-year right to emit. And that's the problem with the dilemma they face with the argy-bargy over compensation, is they're only compensating producers with 5-year permits. If you could compensate with 100-year permits, there's more money to slosh around because you're stealing from future generations their right to emit and you're giving it to the current generation in return for a better climate in the future. That's a real honest trade-off that the politicians should be prepared to make.
If this played out as a national security issue, could it ever play out as that?
Quite easily be a national security issue.
And I'll go to Bernard perhaps in this, are you more likely to get bipartisan support?
Look,
Because that's what you see.
this exchange has just summed up one of the key problems we've had, which is politicians who, for whatever reason, are unable to sell the simplest policies. If they couldn't sell something like the RSPT, the CPRS was, and of course they're obsessed with having 4-letter acronyms. But the task of selling that scheme, and I agree with Warwick that it's not necessary that people understood it in detail, and people didn't understand it in detail. But this comes back to a basic inability, I think, of politicians to actually sell anything, well, virtually anything. I was going to say anything more complicated than most basic policies. Sell them and then defend them against the attacks of vested interests and rent seekers. The benefits of an emissions trading scheme, of course, are diffuse and they're long term, and they don't have, most of the beneficiaries have not even been born. The losers are all around about now, and they're well organised and they're well resourced and they're well connected. Now, previous generations of politicians have found a way to actually negotiate those traps and actually put in place good economic policy. For whatever reason, it seems that the current generation of politicians have lost that capacity. So the only thing that worries me about Warwick's scheme is that it would require a politician with basic selling skills to actually mount it. And I'm really not sure that we have those at the moment.
I'll go up the back. I think there's a question up the back here.
Oh, hi there. Do you think
Just get the microphone quite close so we can
Sorry,
hear you.
is it better?
That's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
This is a question. Do you think climate change is a symptom of modern society? I mean, people had countries, had wars, modern industry, and causing environmental pollution. And now, since we're in a relatively peaceful stage, which is like built on economic targets and being mutually cooperative, do we need to enter another stage? And if so, what do we need to for the mass society, for the masses in society? And if so, what do we need to do?
So you're saying there's a lack of urgency because...
Oh, well...
I just can't quite hear you, I'm sorry.
Okay. My issue is just basically, what do we need to enter another stage, another phase in modern society where people need to change a lot? And if so, what are these major changes?
Did any of the panel want to...
I'm not sure. I think we've got the tools to address the problem. I don't think we need a revolutionary change. I think we've got this tool set to actually deal with this issue. I'm not convinced that it
Two
requires some sort of fundamental
two opposition leaders down.
overturning. Well, having just said we haven't got any politicians who actually do this, but we've got the toolkit to actually do it. It's not as though this is a policy problem that is beyond the wit of people of goodwill to actually resolve. So I'm not convinced that somehow we need to overturn everything in order to actually reduce carbon emissions.
Again, it gets back to something that quite a few of us have toyed with, and that's, wherein lies the resistance to actually make the change. And you often hear the argument that, of course, when during the war, with the war effort, people were quite happy to forego their personal, their financial well-being, etc., and they were quite happy to go forward and give up things for the common good. What we're wanting is and people have been frightened by the fact that it's going to be so austere and horrible. But I mean, that there does need to be an attitudinal change, and how we actually collectively, and this is globally collectively, make that shift from everything I can now and continued growth is the only thing that's important to us, to the fact that, well, there are many other things that are valuable in life. And again, sort of logically, people realise that the true things that people really value are not the economic things, and it's not stuff, and it's not all that business. And it's sort of at what point we can get back and start thinking that. We don't want to have to actually go onto this, for it to be legislated and hard and for the World War footing to be able to make those sacrifices, just moving on to appreciating that what we really value in life, which is families and love and food and all those nice things.
Frank Jotzo, and we're coming to the end. We're coming up to 7 o'clock, and it's a Monday night. But if you do want to ask a question, please put your hand up, and then we'll bring it to an end. But Frank?
And I agree wholeheartedly with that, but I'd like to add that you don't even need to take it out of the realm of the economic and materialistic. We just need to keep reminding ourselves that what we're risking here is really the future economic welfare of our societies, right? And Australia, it's not just the economic impacts that on the bad end of things we're facing in Australia, it's also the bad end scenarios in our neighbours. We do rely in this country on trade relationships with other economies for our own welfare. And we're putting all that on the line collectively as a global society if we don't tackle the problem. And how do you translate that into domestic policy action is really the crucial thing. And if you want to get anywhere at all, you will need political leadership on the issue. And you cannot have politics kind of like a weather vane kind of, sounding out what the latest fad is in the electorate. You need a vision to be put before the people, and some leadership and some trying it out and starting down that.
But it's harder than that, Frank. You not only need political leadership today. If you don't design the system properly, you have to come up with a political leader every single generation into the future. The chances that we can do that as a country and not fall into what we've just seen in this election is pretty close to zero. So whoever has the political commitment should lock it in through the economic system, through long-term property rights. And then people react to the bottom line, as well-meaning as some people want them to be. You've got to get them at the bottom line, and you've got to make everyone believe it's their own self-interest to move forward in this direction. And then you only need one political leader, and that's right now, to lock this system in place.
It's primarily a political issue, and unfortunately it looks at this point in time there's a real risk that we're going to go to the wall on this issue, having all the tools to solve it.
And that was my question about if it's agreed that this is a national security issue. If it's sold as that, is that the one time you can get bipartisanship?
It's not a national security issue. We don't incur the cost right away, but we incur the cost in the future, and that's the problem.
We don't sell this to people. This sounds like the political debates we're seeing in Australian society today. It's not the selling, it's the realisation and bringing to the fore a policy that will actually do what we need it to do. The idea that we have to sell it, I think, is problematic, because then you'll get the sort of policies that we're seeing right now. A sell policy which is not based on something sound. We need a sound, credible framework. We don't have that from either side of politics.
And yet in the media, you're required to balance. And that particularly here at the public broadcaster, I'm required to provide balance. So this is where I suppose that point becomes problematic. I would be required to put someone up who would argue against the science on and give them the same time.
We'd argue that
Well,
balance is sort of misreporting the, I think might be one of yours, Will, the misreporting the football score if it was 99
That's
to
the
1.
analogy I used. You need balance in reporting a soccer match. And you say the balance is, oh, it's a very close match. It's going to go to penalty shootout. We don't know who's going to win. You have to balance it. When someone asks what the score is, it's 99 to 1. You know, is this balance? You know, is this the sort of balance we need?
I just raised that point.
The problem the ABC's got, and I'm always accusing the ABC of balance without judgment, is that when it seeks to balance something, the people it goes to for the balance aren't equipped to actually provide it. This might get me lynched, but there are somewhat credible climate skeptics out there who question various aspects of the anthropogenic global warming hypothesis, who may not be complete skeptics but do raise significant issues about it. They seem to never be heard from, but you get the Chris Monktons of the world getting free run on the ABC. Now that's I think that's what I mean by when I talk about balance without judgment. It's fulfilling those editorial guidelines, and you're required to do it, but actually doing it in a way that serves the interest of the listener or the viewer, and I'm not sure, or the reader, as it is now.
But again, you don't have to believe in the science to know that there's an economic case to take action, because we're risking the next 20 or 30 years worth of energy system development in this country by doing nothing. So even if you're a total skeptic, a do nothing option, as long as you control the costs, is actually a good strategy. So the skeptics should come up on board immediately under the system that I'm advocating, because at least I'm controlling the costs.
But still someone's going to have to sell it. You know, someone's going to have to sell it, say, just at the moment. Someone's going to have to sell it to the Greens to get it through. In order to sell it to the Greens, you're going to have to give them some way of selling it to the community. There's always a selling element in this.
And that's my point about the media too.
That's one of the great challenges that have to be overcome. I think, as we've discussed, I think there's a lot of positives in the scheme that you propose. But at the moment, one of the great challenges is being able to sell that to people. And I don't have any great solutions. I'm not a marketer.
Well, just one more question. I think we better wrap it. Yep.
Sorry, Andrew, you mentioned that the question of clunkers idea was just an idea that really made the electorate feel as though politics was doing something that wasn't very economically feasible, that wasn't really doing a lot for the environment. Why do you think, if there's other ideas which would be doing more for the environment and would be more economically feasible, why wouldn't they sell just as well for the electorate? Why wouldn't they?
Have a look at all the policies we've done thus far and where we're focusing all the attention. It's on the household sector. Household sector, why? It's because we live there. We can chuck money at PVs because we can put them on our houses. Everybody, a large proportion of the population drives a car. So what does the government do? It looks at ways to give you subsidies for cars. That's why in the household sector represents, 10% of Australia's emissions? There's still 90%. Why are we not concentrating on the other areas? It's because they can give you policies to throw money at you and do pork barrelling, in my opinion.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. And let me thank the fantastic panel tonight, and Andrew Macintosh, Professor Will Steffen, Frank Jotzo, Dr. Liz Hanna, Professor Warwick McKibbin and Bernard Keane. Thank them very much.